Have you ever noticed how rainy days have a different atmosphere? The rain, the cloudy sky, the sound of the drops hitting the window. It all seems to create the perfect setting for scary stories. In today's video, we're going to explore 7 horror stories involving rainy days, all based on true accounts that will give you goosebumps. So get ready to immerse yourself in a dark and mysterious atmosphere. And before we start, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and activate the bell, because there's always content here that will stir your imagination. Now turn off the lights, turn up the volume, and let's go. 1. The house at the end of the road. It was a stormy night on an isolated road in the Irish countryside. Clara was driving with difficulty, trying to see through the soaked windshield. The sound of the rain beating against the glass was almost deafening, and the thunder echoed with a force that made the car vibrate slightly. The trees along the road swayed violently in the wind, as if they were living creatures trying to escape from something invisible. Clara was exhausted and anxious to get to the small hotel where she would spend the night, but the road seemed endless. Then she saw something ahead. A female figure wrapped in a dark cloak was standing by the side of the road, desperately beckoning for help. Clara hesitated. It was late and everything about the scene seemed wrong. Who would be walking alone in such a remote place during a storm? But guilt began to weigh on her. What if that person really needed help? Taking a deep breath, she stopped the car and lowered the window. "Are you all right?" asked Clara, trying to sound confident despite her growing discomfort. The woman didn't answer immediately. Her face was partially covered by the hood of her cloak, but Clara could see her eyes, deep, dark eyes that seemed to contain centuries of untold stories. "Please," the woman said in a low, hoarse voice, "I need a safe place." Clara nodded, although something inside her screamed to go. "Get in," she said, unlocking the passenger door. The woman got in without saying another word and pointed to a small dirt track that led into the forest. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to form a dark tunnel around the car. The silence inside the vehicle was oppressive. Clara tried to strike up a conversation, but the woman remained silent, staring out of the window as if she was seeing something Clara couldn't see. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, Clara spotted an old house in the middle of the forest. The building seemed to have been abandoned decades ago. The windows were broken, the walls covered in moss, and ivy climbed like snakes along the structure. Even from a distance, there was something deeply wrong with the place. "This is it," the woman finally said, breaking the silence. Clara parked the car and looked at the house skeptically. "Are you sure? It looks abandoned." The woman didn't answer. She simply got out of the car and started walking towards the house. Reluctantly, Clara got out too, holding her jacket against the biting wind as she followed the strange figure. On entering the house, Clara was immediately overcome by a feeling of unease. The air was icy and charged with a pungent smell of rotting wood and something else. Something metallic, like rusty blood. The furniture was covered in thick dust. Cobwebs hung from the corners of the ceiling, and the floor creaked under his feet. However, what most caught his eye was a large mirror in the center of the main room. It seemed out of place in the decadent surroundings, as if it had just been placed there. The frame was adorned with grotesque figures carved in aged gold, faces contorted into expressions of pain and terror. Clara felt a shiver run down her spine as she stared into the mirror. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that seemed to call to her silently. "This is the mirror of Moor Hall," said the woman behind her in an almost whispered voice. "They say it imprisons the souls of those who dare to stare at its reflection for too long." Clara laughed nervously, trying to dispel the growing tension. "Is that some kind of local legend?" The woman didn't answer immediately. She just stared at the mirror with an expression that mixed reverence and fear. "It's not a legend," she finally said. Clara instinctively took a step back, but her eyes remained fixed on the mirror. Something seemed to be wrong with her reflection. It was subtle at first, a shadow in the background that shouldn't be there, or a strange movement in the golden frame. Then it happened. Her reflection slowly began to distort before her eyes. Her face seemed to melt like wax under the intense heat. Her eyes turned coal black, and her mouth widened into a grotesque smile that wasn't hers. Clara tried to look away, but she couldn't. It was as if something invisible was holding her head in place. She felt cold hands gripping her shoulders, or maybe it was just her imagination. It didn't matter anymore. She was paralyzed with terror. Suddenly, an irresistible force began to pull her towards the mirror. She screamed and tried to resist, but it was no use. The invisible hands grew stronger, dragging her forward until her whole body was on the surface, cold as black water. On the other side of the mirror there was absolute darkness, an icy void where voices whispered incomprehensible words around her. She tried to scream again, but no sound came out of her mouth. Then everything fell silent. In the main room of the abandoned house, Clara was still there, or at least something that seemed to be her. Her eyes now shone with a sinister, inhuman light as she slowly turned to face the mysterious woman. "It's done," said the entity with a cold smile, before calmly leaving the house and disappearing into the storm. Clara was never seen again by anyone who knew her, but reports began to emerge about a strange woman wandering the roads near the forest during violent storms. She was said to lure unsuspecting motorists to the house at the end of the road, where they also disappeared without a trace. The house remains there to this day, shrouded in mystery and fear. Some locals claim to hear voices coming from inside it during stormy nights. Others swear they have seen faces trapped in the mirror through the broken windows. But no one dares enter to find out the truth, because everyone knows that whoever goes into that house never comes out the same. Or at all. 2. The Rain Passenger. During a rainy night in Dublin, Ireland, Liam, an experienced taxi driver, was driving through the wet streets, trying to find passengers. It was a night like any other, except for the gloomy weather. The torrential rain turned the streets into rivers, and the wind howled as if it carried ancient secrets. He was about to end his shift when he spotted a man standing under a flashing street lamp. The man was completely soaked, with a black overcoat clinging to his body and a hat that barely protected him from the water. Liam slowed down and stopped next to him. The man got into the cab without saying a word and handed over a €50 note before even indicating the destination. "To Glasnevin Cemetery," he said in a low, husky voice. The request made Liam hesitate for a moment. It was unusual for someone to want to go to a cemetery at that time of night, especially in such hostile weather. But the money was already in his hands, and he decided not to question it. The passenger was strange. He was completely silent, staring out of the window as raindrops trickled down the glass. Liam tried to make conversation to ease the tension. "Heavy night, isn't it? It feels like the sky's falling in." The man didn't reply, just turned his head slowly to face him. His eyes were deep and dark, as if they were hiding something that Liam didn't want to find out. The walk to the cemetery seemed longer than usual. The streets were deserted, and the sound of the windshield wipers was the only noise apart from the incessant drumming of the rain on the roof of the car. Liam began to feel increasingly uncomfortable, as if he were being watched by something other than the passenger. When they finally reached the gate to Glasnevin Cemetery, the man asked them to get off right there. He got out of the car without saying anything and walked slowly towards the graves, disappearing into the darkness between the headstones. Liam waited for a few minutes, but the passenger didn't return. He decided to get out of the car to check. With his cell phone flashlight in hand, Liam entered the cemetery. The rain had stopped, but the air was heavy and cold. He walked among the gravestones, calling out for the man without getting an answer. It was then that he saw something that made his heart stop for an instant, a headstone with his own name engraved on it. The headstone was simple but unmistakable. Liam O'Connor, it read clearly, followed by his date of birth, and that day's date of death. Next to the headstone was a note stuck with a stone. Trembling, Liam took the paper and read the words written in irregular handwriting. "Get ready." Desperate, he ran back to the cab and sped away from the cemetery without looking back. His mind was in chaos. Who was that man? How could his name be on a tombstone? And what did that notice mean? The next morning, still shaken by the experience of the night before, Liam decided to investigate more about the mysterious man. He returned to the cemetery during the day and found the headstone exactly where he had seen it the night before. This time, however, it looked old and weathered. There was no note. As he stood there, a cemetery employee approached him. "Can I help you?" asked the elderly man with a curious look on his face. "That headstone, it has my name on it," said Liam in a shaky voice. The official looked at the headstone and then at Liam with a serious expression. "That headstone has been here for decades," he said calmly. "It belonged to a man who died tragically. They say he was a taxi driver." Liam felt a shiver run down his spine. He tried to argue that it didn't make sense. How could there be another person with exactly his name and profession? But before he could continue the conversation, he was interrupted by the sound of screeching tires in the distance. Back in the cab that fateful night, while driving through the still wet streets of Dublin, Liam noticed something strange in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, he saw the mysterious passenger's face reflected there, even though he was alone in the car. Over the next few days, Liam began to notice strange signs in his daily life. Objects out of place in his house, shadows moving in the periphery of his vision, disturbing dreams about car accidents and open graves. He tried to dismiss it all as a figment of his imagination, exacerbated by the experience in the cemetery. But then it happened. One rainy night, exactly a week after meeting the passenger, Liam lost control of the cab on a dangerous bend while swerving away from another vehicle coming the other way. The car skidded on the wet road and crashed violently into a tree by the side of the road. When paramedics arrived at the scene of the accident hours later, they found only twisted wreckage and a note inside the rain-soaked cab. "You have been warned." To this day, drivers avoid driving along that road during rainy nights in Dublin. They say they sometimes see an empty cab parked by the side of the road or hear voices whispering among the graves in Glasnevin Cemetery. 3. The cottage on the lake. During a torrential storm in a remote region of Oregon in the United States, a group of 5 friends, Emily, Jack, Sarah, Matt, and Olivia, were driving in search of shelter. The vacation planned to be a peaceful day. Outdoors had been ruined by the unpredictable weather. The rain was so heavy that they could barely see the winding road ahead. It was then that they spotted a cabin by a lake, hidden among dense trees and shrouded in an unsettling mist. "We have no choice," said Jack, the most pragmatic of the group. "Let's stay here until the storm passes." The hut looked abandoned, but the door was unlocked. The interior was rustic and simple, aged wooden furniture, an unlit fireplace, and a slightly damp smell that seemed to come from the nearby lake. Despite everything, it was cozy enough to protect them from the incessant rain. As they explored the place, Sarah found an old diary in a drawer in the living room. The cover was worn, and the pages were yellowed by time. "Look at this," she said, attracting the others' attention. "It looks like someone lived here a long time ago." Curious, they sat around the fireplace while Sarah read the first few pages aloud. The diary chronicled the life of a fisherman who had lived in the hut decades ago. At first, The notes were routine, descriptions of the weather, the lake, and the daily catch. But as the pages progressed, the tone changed dramatically. "Something strange is happening to the lake," Sarah read hesitantly. "I hear voices at night, whispers coming from the water." The friends exchanged uneasy glances, but Sarah continued. The following entries described increasingly disturbing events: disappearances of local residents, animals found dead on the banks, and strange lights seen under the surface of the lake at night. Then came the most terrifying revelation. "The fishermen believed that something lived in the lake," said Sarah with a trembling voice, "something ancient and hungry. He wrote that the locals began performing human sacrifices to appease the creature." "That's ridiculous," said Matt, trying to hide his discomfort with sarcasm. "It's probably just a story to scare children." But Emily didn't seem convinced. What if it isn't? What if there is something in the lake? That night, while everyone was trying to sleep, Emily was woken up by a strange sound coming from outside. A sound that sounded like a distant moan, mixed with the sound of churning water. Unable to ignore her curiosity, she went out of the hut with a flashlight in her hand. The rain had subsided, but the air was still heavy and damp. When she reached the shore of the lake, she saw something that made her heart stop. Perfect circles forming in the calm water, as if something was moving just below the surface. Before she could react, she felt a presence behind her. The next morning, the others woke up and realized that Emily had disappeared. Her backpack was still in the hut, but there was no sign of her anywhere. "She must have gone out exploring," said Jack nervously. "Let's go look for her." As they searched the surroundings of the hut and the banks of the lake, they found footprints that ended abruptly in the water. There were no signs of a struggle or any clues as to Emily's whereabouts. "This is getting too weird," said Olivia with tears in her eyes. "We need to get out of here now." But when they tried to call for help, they found that their cell phones had no signal, something strange in that region where they knew there should be phone coverage. That night another disappearance occurred. Matt was last seen sitting on the porch of the cabin before disappearing without a trace. The remaining 3 were now in total panic. "This is no coincidence," said Sarah, as she frantically flipped through the diary in the hope of finding some answers. It was then that she found a final note. "The hut is a trap. It lures them to feed the monster in the lake." Jack tried to keep calm and suggested that everyone stay together until dawn to avoid any more disappearances. But during the early hours of the morning, Sarah woke up alone in the main room of the cabin. Jack and Olivia had disappeared. Desperate and terrified, Sarah decided to flee alone through the forest in the opposite direction to the lake. The rain had started again in full force, making it difficult to see and the ground slippery. As she ran between the dark trees, she heard footsteps behind her, heavy, rhythmic footsteps that didn't sound human. When she finally reached the main road at dawn, she found a car passing by and was able to call for help. The local police were called and began a search of the hut and the lake. Days later, the bodies of her friends were found in the depths of the lake by local divers, all with expressions of terror frozen on their pale faces. Sarah was never able to get over the events of that fateful night. She left the state and moved away from Oregon, but sometimes she still dreams of the sound of whispers coming from the water, whispers that seem to call her back to the lake. The cabin remains there to this day, abandoned at the edge of the misty lake, a grim reminder of the ancient secrets hidden beneath its dark waters. 4. The voice on the radio. It was a cold, rainy night in the Scottish countryside, and Anna was driving alone along a deserted road. The sky looked like a black cloak without stars, and the rain fell in torrents, turning the winding road into a treacherous mirror of water. The sound of the drops hitting the roof of the car was constant, almost hypnotic, while the windshield wipers struggled to keep the view minimally clear. Anna was tired, but determined to reach her destination before exhaustion overcame her. The car radio was tuned to a local station that played soft music, something to dispel the oppressive silence of the night. But suddenly the music was interrupted by static. Anna frowned and adjusted the dial, thinking that perhaps it was the storm interfering with the signal. The static persisted for a few seconds before giving way to something much stranger. A female voice emerged from the noise. "Please, help me," said the voice, weak and shaky. Anna froze for a moment, her fingers tightening on the steering wheel. "What was that?" she muttered to herself. The voice continued, now clearer. "I'm stuck. On the road. Near the bend. Please come." Anna's heart began to beat faster. She looked around through the car window, but all she could see was darkness and rain. The voice seemed to be coming straight from the radio. Trying to stay calm, she asked out loud, "Who's there? Do you need help?" There was no immediate response. Only static filled the space for a few seconds before the voice came back. "Please, quickly, before it's too late." Anna felt a shiver run down her spine. Something in that voice sounded terribly familiar, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly what. Against her better judgment, and ignoring the instinct that told her to keep driving, she decided to follow the voice's instructions. As she drove along the deserted road, each kilometer seemed longer than the last. The rain had subsided to a fine drizzle, but the air was still heavy and charged with a sense of unease. After a few minutes, Anna spotted a bend ahead, exactly as described by the voice. It was then that her headlights illuminated something on the side of the road. An abandoned car. It was an old model, with the doors open and the headlights off. Anna slowly stopped her vehicle and watched for a few seconds before getting out to investigate. The fine rain was wetting her hair as she approached the abandoned car cautiously. The interior was empty, but something caught her eye. The car's radio was also on, emitting the same static she had heard earlier. "Hello?" Anna called out loudly, her voice echoing in the silent darkness. There was no reply. On the passenger seat of the abandoned car was a broken portable rear-view mirror and a folded piece of paper with something handwritten on it. Trembling slightly, Anna picked up the paper and read the words blurred by the water, "You shouldn't be here." Her heart raced as she looked around frantically. Everything was too quiet. Even the sounds of the forest seemed to have disappeared. Feeling watched, she ran back to her car and locked the doors. As she tried to start the engine to get out of there as quickly as possible, her own car radio came on by itself. The same female voice emerged again from the static. "You came, but now it's too late." Anna froze in place as she heard her own breathing become heavy. She looked through the rearview mirror and saw something that made her blood run cold. An indistinct figure was standing in the road behind her. It was impossible to discern details because of the darkness and the fine rain, but it seemed to be approaching slowly. She tried to start the engine once more, this time successfully, and sped away without looking back. When she finally reached the nearest town, Anna stopped at a gas station to catch her breath. She told the attendant about the abandoned car and the strange transmission on the radio. He listened attentively before saying something that made her heart stop. "This road is known for strange things," he said with a serious tone. "For years, they've said that people have heard voices calling for help before disappearing." Anna tried to argue that this was impossible. She had clearly heard someone calling for help. But then he asked calmly, "What if you were the one who needed help?" Confused and frightened, Anna returned home that night, unable to sleep properly. Over the next few days, she tried to forget the incident until something even more disturbing happened. While driving along the same road on another rainy night, this time unintentionally, she heard the same transmission on the radio again. "Please, help me." This time, she recognized something terrifying. It was her own voice begging for help. Anna then realized the horrible truth. She was trapped in a time loop caused by her death on that deserted road. Every time she heard the radio broadcast, she was drawn back to the fateful moment when she was trying to save someone without realizing that it was herself. Determined to escape this hellish cycle, Anna tried to avoid driving on that road again or listening to any radio broadcasts during storms, but it seemed pointless. She always ended up back at the same inevitable point. To this day, drivers report hearing mysterious voices on that road during rainy nights. Voices that beg for help before disappearing into the static of the radio. 5. The Red Umbrella. During a night of incessant rain in London, Lucas walked hurriedly through the wet streets, trying to protect himself with the hood of his jacket. The city looked like a film noir set, with the streetlights reflecting in the puddles and the constant sound of the rain drowning out the noises of the metropolis. He was returning home after a long day's work, wanting nothing more than to escape the cold and damp. Then something caught his eye. In the middle of the sidewalk, near a dimly lit corner, there was an abandoned red umbrella. It was open, with water running down its edges, but it looked intact, as if it had been left there recently. Lucas hesitated for a moment. It was unusual to find such an umbrella, especially in a city where any protection from the rain was prized. Someone must have forgotten it, he thought, picking it up. It was an elegant umbrella with a polished wooden handle and vibrant red fabric. Despite being wet, it looked almost new. Lucas looked around to see if the owner was nearby, but the street was deserted. He decided to take it with him. After all, he was soaking wet and needed something to protect himself. As he walked under the red umbrella, a strange feeling began to wash over him. It was as if he was being watched. He looked over his shoulder several times, but saw nothing but the empty streets and the incessantly falling rain. "It must be my imagination," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the discomfort. When he got home, Lucas left his umbrella drying in the hallway and went straight to the shower. The hot water helped to relax him, but the feeling of being watched persisted. He convinced himself that it was just accumulated tiredness and went to sleep. That night, he had disturbing dreams. In his mind, disconnected images appeared. Shadowy figures moving in the rain, glowing eyes watching him from the shadows, and flashes of something violent happening under the red glare of the umbrella. He woke up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night and realized that the sound of the rain seemed louder than before, as if it were inside his own head. The next day, as he was leaving for work, Lucas picked up the umbrella again. The rain still hadn't let up. However, as he walked through the city's busy streets, he began to notice something strange. Reflections in store windows showed indistinct figures following him from a distance. When he turned to look directly, there was no one there. His discomfort grew with each passing hour. At work, Lucas could barely concentrate. He felt as if something was constantly hovering over him. During lunch, he decided to research cursed objects or stories related to red umbrellas. Perhaps it was just an attempt to rationalize his fears. It was then that he came across an obscure article on an online forum about London urban legends. One of the stories talked about a red umbrella that mysteriously appeared during storms and brought bad luck to those who used it. According to the legend, it belonged to a woman called Margaret Hensley, who was brutally murdered during a rainy night in the 1940s while carrying an identical umbrella. The story went that her death was so violent that her spirit became attached to the object, cursing it to attract similar tragedies to its new owners. Lucas laughed nervously as he read it. "It's just a coincidence," he said aloud to himself. But deep down he felt that something was wrong. That night, as he walked home under the red umbrella once again, he heard footsteps behind him, rhythmic and constant, even though there was no one visible in the dark streets around him. The sound seemed to get closer every moment until he stopped abruptly and turned around. Nothing. The silence was deafening, apart from the sound of the rain hitting the fabric of the umbrella. But when he looked down into the puddle at his feet, he saw reflections that were not his own. Shadowy figures stood there, tall and indistinct, surrounding him like predators waiting for the right moment to strike. Lucas dropped his umbrella on the ground and ran without looking back until he arrived home, panting. He locked all the doors and windows before throwing himself on the sofa, trying to catch his breath. But no matter where he was, he felt surrounded by the presence of these invisible entities. Over the next few days, things only got worse. Shadows moved around the house even when all the lights were on. Whispers echoed in the corridors in the early hours of the morning. Objects disappeared or inexplicably moved. Desperate for answers and to get rid of the object, Lucas decided to return to the place where he had originally found the red umbrella. Perhaps returning it would put an end to all this. But when he got there, he found something terrifying. Another man standing exactly where he had found the object days before, now holding that same umbrella. Before he could shout or warn him of imminent danger, he clearly saw shadowy figures slowly emerging behind him. 6. The rain that never stops. The village of Greyhaven, hidden between mountains in the north of Scotland, was a quiet place, almost forgotten by time. Its residents lived in harmony with nature, surrounded by dense forests and a crystal-clear loch that provided sustenance and beauty to the community. But everything changed when the rain started. At first, no one was worried. Rain was common in that region, especially during the fall. But the days turned into weeks, and the rain showed no signs of stopping. The cobbled streets began to fill with water, the fields became soaked, and the lake began to overflow. The grey sky seemed eternal, and the constant sound of the drops hitting the roofs became an oppressive soundtrack for the residents. Soon, the floods began to wreak havoc. Houses were overtaken by water, crops were destroyed, and despair began to spread through the village. But what really terrified the villagers was what came with the rain. In the third week of incessant rain, reports began to emerge of strange figures seen at night near the lake. They were described as tall, slender creatures with pale skin and glowing eyes that seemed to reflect the light like those of a nocturnal animal. Some said they heard whispers coming from the water. Others claimed to have seen hands emerging from the flooded puddles in the streets. And then people began to disappear. The first was a fisherman called Ewan, who had gone out to check his nets in the lake at dusk. When he didn't come home, his wife organized a search with some neighbors. They found his boat overturned on the shore of the lake and strange marks in the mud, as if something large had been dragged into the water. After him, it was a young woman called Isla, who disappeared while returning home after visiting her grandmother. Her umbrella was found abandoned in a flooded street, but there was no sign of her. Residents were terrified. Many locked themselves in their homes, but still the creatures seemed to find them. During the darkest nights, sounds of something heavy moving through the water could be heard outside the closed windows. Among the villagers was Callum, a curious and brave young man who had lost his younger brother during the first few weeks of rain. He refused to accept that the creatures were just a figment of the collective imagination or widespread panic. Determined to discover the origin of the curse that plagued Greyhaven, Callum began to investigate. He scoured the village's old records in the small local library and found vague mentions of a forgotten legend. The Lake of Greyhaven was said to be inhabited by ancient spirits known as the Drowned. According to legend, these entities were the souls of people sacrificed centuries ago by a cult that believed that human blood could calm the waters and ensure abundant harvests. Callum also found a disturbing detail. The cult had been broken up by angry villagers who killed their leaders and threw their bodies into the lake in revenge. Since then, It was said that a curse hung over Greyhaven, a promise that the waters would take their toll if they were disturbed again. Convinced that something had awakened these sleeping spirits, Callum decided to act. He believed there had to be a way to break the curse before everyone in the village was taken by the creatures. That night, armed with a flashlight and an old diary found in the library archives, supposedly belonging to the leader of the old cult, Callum went down to the lake. The rain was heavier than ever, and every step felt like a challenge as he trudged through the mud to the shore. When he got there, he lit his flashlight and began to read aloud the words recorded in the diary, a ritual described as the final appeasement. The words were difficult to pronounce, written in an ancient language that he could barely decipher. As he read, the waters of the lake began to churn violently. High waves formed despite the absence of wind, and figures began to emerge from the liquid darkness. The same creatures described by the locals, tall, skeletal, and with eyes glowing like beacons in the night. Callum continued reading despite his growing fear. The creatures advanced slowly towards him, but seemed to hesitate whenever he pronounced certain words of the ritual. When he finished the last verse of the ancient text, the creatures stopped abruptly. For a moment there was absolute silence. Even the sound of the rain seemed to have ceased. Then the figures began to slowly retreat into the lake until they disappeared completely under its dark waters. The next morning, for the first time in weeks, the sun appeared over Greyhaven. The rain had finally stopped. Although many of the residents were relieved that the nightmare was over, Callum knew that the danger was not completely gone. He believed that the ritual had only put the spirits to sleep again. But for how long? And what would be the price for disturbing them? Greyhaven gradually returned to normal, but Callum never forgot that night at the lake, nor the glowing eyes of the creatures watching him as he fought the unknown to save his village. 7. The Children of the Park. It was a grey afternoon in Edinburgh, Scotland. The sky was heavy with clouds, and a fine rain was falling incessantly, covering the city with a melancholy veil. Julio, a Brazilian teacher who had recently moved to the city, decided to take a walk in the park near his apartment. He liked the tranquility the place offered, especially on rainy days when hardly anyone ventured there. The park was deserted, except for the soft sound of the rain hitting the leaves of the trees and the occasional cawing of crows perched on the branches. Julio was walking slowly along the gravel path, lost in his thoughts, when something caught his eye. In the far corner of the park, where there was an old playground with rusty swings and a weathered slide, he saw children playing. There were 3 of them. 2 were on the swings, moving slowly back and forth, while the third was spinning in circles around a rusty merry-go-round. They wore simple, old-fashioned clothes, light dresses and suspenders that seemed out of place in time. Julio frowned. It was unusual to see children playing alone in that park, especially on such a cold and rainy day. He hesitated for a moment before approaching. "Hi, where are your parents?" he asked loudly. The children stopped abruptly. The swings creaked slightly as they slowed to a stop. Slowly, the 3 turned their heads towards Julio. It was then that he realized something that made his heart soar. They had no eyes. Where the eyeballs should have been, there were only black, empty cavities. Julio instinctively stepped back, feeling a chill run down his spine. Before he could say anything, the children started whispering in unison. The words were incomprehensible, but there was something deeply disturbing about the cadence of the whispers, as if they were part of an ancient, forgotten ritual. Who are you?" he managed to ask in a shaky voice. One of the children stepped forward. She was a small girl with blonde hair tied up in rain-soaked braids. She tilted her head to the side unnaturally and pointed at Julio with a thin, pale finger. "His return is near," she said in a hoarse voice that didn't sound like it belonged to a child. Julio didn't wait to hear anymore. He turned and started running along the park path, the sound of his footsteps mixing with the noise of the rain. He didn't dare look back, but he had the feeling that he was being followed. When he finally reached the safety of his apartment, he locked the door behind him and tried to catch his breath. His heart was beating so fast that he could hardly think straight. "It was my imagination," he told himself over and over again, trying to convince himself that what he had seen was the result of tiredness or some cruel joke. But that night, while he was trying to sleep, he heard something strange coming from the living room window, the rhythmic sound of swings creaking. With his heart in his throat, he slowly got up and went to the window. When he pulled back the curtains to look outside, his blood ran cold. The 3 children were standing on the sidewalk in front of the building, looking straight at him. Or at least that's what it looked like, despite the empty sockets where their eyes should have been. They didn't move or make a sound, apart from the subtle sound of the rain falling around them. Julio quickly closed the curtains and tried to think of what to do. Would he call the police? But how would he explain it? Who would believe him? He picked up the phone with trembling hands, but before he could dial any numbers, the lights in the apartment began to flicker. The sound of the swings got louder, as if he were inside the apartment now. "Go away," muttered Julio to himself as he backed up against the opposite wall of the living room. But then he heard something even worse. Soft knocks on the front door. "Open up," said a childish voice from the other side of the door. It was sweet and calm, but carried an underlying threatening tone. Julio stood motionless, holding his breath as the knocks continued. He knew he couldn't open that door. Something inside him screamed that it would be the end if he did. After what seemed like hours, although it was probably only minutes, the knocking stopped. Silence returned to the apartment, except for the distant sound of the rain outside. The next morning, Julio found small, wet handprints all over the front door and windows of the apartment. He decided to leave Edinburgh that very day and never return to the park or the city. But sometimes he still dreams of those eyeless children and wakes up in the middle of the night with the feeling of being watched. And those were the 7 horror stories involving rainy days. So, what did you think? Which one gave you the creeps? Tell us in the comments. If you like this video and want to see more content like this, don't forget to leave your like. It really helps the channel grow and brings you even more scary stories. And of course, if you're not subscribed yet, take the opportunity to subscribe now and activate the little bell. Until the next video, and watch out for rainy days.